Welcome to the deep dive. We have a truly remarkable exploration ahead of us today. We're looking at that intersection between a catastrophic medical event and a profound spiritual experience.
And this all comes from a question from you, podcaster Elton.
Yeah.
And it's just a privilege to get to dive into this. Your story is, well, it's already an incredible case of recovery.
It really is.
But the psychological part you shared, that turns it into a fascinating neurological mystery.
Absolutely. So just to recap for everyone, Elton had an ischemic stroke. And because of just phenomenal speed, his daughter got him to Stanford Hospital, which was only 10 minutes away.
Incredible.
He got the clot-busting drug, TPA, within 47 minutes.
47.
Yeah.
That's gold standard. That kind of timing is what every stroke center aims for.
And the result was a 97 to 98% recovery of his function. I mean, that's a medical miracle in itself.
It is. Medically, that 47-minute window explains the incredible physical recovery. It saves so much brain tissue.
But, and here at the core of your question, Elton, this powerful sense of tranquility, this feeling of being blessed, of being divinely protected, you even called it an almost out-of-body experience. That began before the TPA was even in your system. It started during the acute trauma itself.
And that timing is absolutely everything. It means whatever caused that feeling of peace, it was triggered by the injury itself, not by the relief of the treatment working.
Right. It's not gratitude in hindsight.
Not at all. It's something happening in the moment.
So that's our mission for you today. First, we'll look at the science. What do we know about a positive mindset post-stroke? And then the bigger question, is there any research on the brain circuitry of these spiritual experiences, this feeling of protection during acute stress?
We're basically searching for the biological and psychological protective factors that might have just switched on in that 47-minute window.
Okay, let's start there with what we can measure. We can't put divine protection in a clinical trial, but we can absolutely measure optimism.
That's the perfect entry point. Let's just set aside the spiritual nature of the feeling for a second and just focus on the psychology of optimism. There's compelling data from the SRUP study. That's the Stroke Recovery in Underserved Population study.
And how did a big study like that define something as personal as optimism?
Well, they defined it pretty clinically as a positive personality trait, a sense of hopefulness for the future, anticipating the best possible outcomes.
A glass half full kind of person.
Essentially, yes. And they wanted to see if that baseline trait could actually predict recovery. So they tracked people for a full year.
And the results weren't minor, I take it.
Oh, they were dramatic. The study showed that optimism and depression are synergistically associated with recovery. They measured it using something called the Functional Independence Measure, or FIME score.
Let's pause on that, the FIME score. What does that actually mean for someone recovering? What does it measure?
It's a really practical scale. It rates how well a person can do daily tasks. We're talking about walking, dressing, bathing, even communicating.
Yeah. So real-world independence.
Exactly. A higher score means you're more independent. And a change of just a few points can mean the difference between needing a caregiver and being on your own.
That really puts the numbers in perspective. So what was the recovery gap they found?
It was stark, especially in the first few months. The group they called Optimistic Without Depression, they saw the most rapid recovery by far. We're talking about gaining an estimated 24 points on their FEM scores in the first 3 months.
24 points. That's a massive leap towards getting your life back.
It's the definition of an accelerated recovery. Now, you compare that to the group who were non-optimistic with depression.
Okay.
They had the least recovery over the whole year. They ended up 6.1 points behind the optimistic group. That 6-point gap might mean they needed more help at home for much, much longer.
So connecting this back to your experience, Elton, that immediate sense of tranquility, that gratitude, functionally, that was the perfect coping strategy.
It was. That positive appraisal instantly puts you in the psychological state that predicts the best, the most rapid recovery. And that was totally independent of the TPA.
It was a head start.
A huge head start. And it's not just about optimism as a trait. Other studies show that positive emotions like joy, contentment, gratitude measured right at hospital discharge, they are linked to better functional and cognitive status 3 months later. That feeling of peace you had, it acted like a shield.
A shield that let your brain focus on healing instead of, being swamped by despair.
Precisely.
So that leads us right to the next part of your question. We've talked about optimism, but what about faith itself? That feeling of divine intervention, has that been studied?
Yes, it has. There are quite a few studies that draw a direct line between religious belief and coping. The strength of someone's faith often acts as a clear protective factor against emotional distress after a trauma like a stroke.
It gives you a framework for the chaos.
It helps you make meaning out of what feels like a meaningless event. Exactly. Instead of it being this random, terrifying thing, faith can frame it as a challenge, or, in your case, Elton, as evidence of being looked out for.
We hear that anecdotally all the time from survivors.
We do. People talk about a rekindling of faith after an aneurysm or coming out of a coma. They attribute their survival directly to a higher power. It's a fundamental shift in how they see the world, brought on by a neurological crisis.
Which is fascinating when you think about where emotions live in the brain. We know specific lesion locations can completely change someone's emotional state.
We do. And it's a critical point. For example, post-stroke depression is incredibly common, and it's often linked to damage in the left frontal lobe. But something like post-stroke mania, which is very rare,
Right.
that's typically associated with damage to the right hemisphere.
And the right hemisphere is tied to that more holistic emotional processing, spatial awareness.
Exactly. So if there's trauma in that region, even if it's temporary stress from the stroke before the TPA works, it suggests the brain is already in a state of heightened sensitivity to these big emotional and existential shifts.
Okay, so this brings us right to the core of your question, Elton, the almost out-of-body experience, the feeling of protection. How do we get from psychology to the actual brain circuitry of transcendence?
This is where we step into the field of neurotheology.
Yeah.
And the research here it's just incredible. Using techniques like lesion network mapping, scientists have actually found a common brain circuit for spiritual acceptance.
A spiritual circuit.
A spiritual circuit.
Yeah.
And it's centered on a very old, very primal part of the brainstem, the periaqueductal gray.
The PEG.
The PEG, I know that area. Isn't that deeply involved in things like fear and pain and the fight or flight response? It's a survival mechanism. That is its textbook function, yes. Pain suppression, fear conditioning. But this new mapping research has found that this same circuit is also implicated in feelings of unconditional love. And crucially, feelings of being controlled by an external agent.
Wait, hold on. So the part of your brain that processes raw fear and pain is also linked to spiritual peace and acceptance. How does that work? That seems like a complete paradox.
It does, but that's the critical insight. What those studies found is that lesions, or in your case, the acute stress from the stroke, that intersect with certain nodes of this PAG circuit, they are associated with an increase in spirituality.
So damaging or stressing that system can actually unmask or amplify a spiritual capacity.
That's a great way to put it. Think of the brain as having all these inhibitory regulatory functions. By stressing or disrupting those inhibitors, the more raw, fundamental experience that the PAG is also wired for, that feeling of connection, of being looked after, is suddenly unleashed.
The brain's deepest survival tool is also its deepest meaning-making tool.
And that aligns perfectly with your description, Elton, of feeling protected by an external agent. The crisis itself may have activated a pre-wired mechanism for profound spiritualized coping.
That is a powerful explanation. Okay, so what about the other piece? The almost out-of-body feeling, the sense of yourself dissolving.
For that, we have to look up from the brainstem to the parietal lobe.
The brain's GPS system.
Exactly. It's at the top and back of the brain, and it's responsible for your spatial awareness. It tells you where your body ends and the rest of the world begins. It builds your physical sense of self.
So if the PAG is the existential center, the parietal lobe is the location center.
Precisely. And in states of intense, focused, deep meditation, prayer, or acute neurological trauma brain imaging shows the parietal lobe becomes less active.
It quiets down.
It quiets way down. And when that internal mapping system is compromised by the stress of a stroke, the boundary between me and not me it dissolves.
And that's experienced as that feeling of oneness, of unity, or being outside your own body.
That is the neurological mechanism. The brain lets go of its rigid definition of self, allowing that transcendent feeling to flood in, and it perfectly complements what's happening in the PAG circuit.
We should probably also mention the temporal lobe here too, right? It has a long history in this area.
Oh, absolutely. We see it with temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE. Some patients experience a group of behaviors called Gayflin syndrome, and a core feature of that is hyperreligiosity.
An intense focus on religion and philosophy.
An intense preoccupation, yes. We see that patients who have frequent numinous-like auras before a seizure, these intense spiritual feelings, they often show greater spirituality overall. Some even describe these auras as ecstatic experiences.
Wow.
An altered state of consciousness, a feeling of overwhelming joy or presence. So All of this just confirms that this capacity for intense spiritual experience is deeply woven into our brain's structure.
So let's bring this all together for you, Elton. Your experience, while it's so personal, it lines up remarkably well with these documented neurological patterns.
It does. Your initial tranquility and gratitude? That was the perfect psychological state for what was to come. It scientifically predicts and accelerates recovery. It gave you a massive advantage.
And the timing of it all, that profound sense of connection, starting the moment your brain was under attack, it has a plausible neurological address. That feeling of protection is likely tied to that PAG circuit.
A circuit that's hardwired for existential processing, especially under duress. And the out-of-body feeling that's directly linked to that temporary shift in your parietal lobe's function.
So the brain, when faced with this catastrophe, seems to have this built-in capacity for a spiritual experience.
A mechanism that creates meaning out of chaos. It provides the perfect psychological scaffolding for the hard work of recovery.
A phenomenal example of the body's inherent systems for not just physical survival, but for psychological coping as well.
Indeed. It laid the foundation for the optimism and faith that drove your amazing recovery.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to think about. We know the PAG is linked to pain and spiritual feeling, but also to altruism. So how might that core survival circuit, activated so profoundly in your crisis, ultimately shape post-stroke behavior? Does surviving that moment of transcendence lead people like you toward greater compassion or a more purposeful way of living?
That's a fascinating thing to consider.
Yeah.
And thank you, Elton, for sharing such an incredible story and allowing us to connect it to this research.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.